Hi everyone and welcome, my name's Marbozir and I'm here to answer the question from the video title: is Civilization 6 Gathering Storm any good? And the answer is, it depends on what you're looking for exactly. I'm going to tell you straight up. If you're someone who looks for AI improvements first and foremost, and nothing else really matters for you if the AI is still going to be dumb as brick, then the answer is no. No, it's not. There are some AI improvements, so for example, AI will now levy troops from city-states, but that's mostly because one of the new civilizations, Hungary, needs to levy troops from city-states to really be any good. So if the AI wasn't able to do that at all, then it would be pretty much completely useless as Hungary. But other than that, you will still see the AI do plenty of really stupid stuff, like recruit 15 support units of the same type, and almost no military, or use warriors in medieval era when it has access to much better units, or literally never use any air units at all. I have yet to see the AI use them. And so on. So that area of the game didn't really change. What did change is almost everything else in some way. So if you can get over the state of the AI in Civilization 6, or maybe it never really bothered you that much to begin with, then Gathering Storm has a lot to offer. One of the biggest signature features are of course natural disasters, and natural disasters add an aspect of the game that was never really present in any Civilization game before. Yeah, it kind of existed in Civilization 3, but it was very simple there, and it was more about global warming than about localized disasters. Those didn't really exist in any Civilization game before. And now, not only there are specific areas of the map that are prone to disasters, like volcanoes or floodplains, when you know for a fact you might get disasters in that area at some point. And it can be a good thing, because in case of floodplains and volcanoes, you can get additional yields when an actual disaster happens, and it can be a pretty powerful boost, even considering it comes with a downside of damaging your tiles, maybe even killing your population or damaging your districts. But you can remove that downside by using one of the governors, Liang, with a special promotion that makes that city immune to environmental damage. But then there are also natural disasters that don't have anything good about them, they are just purely harmful, like tornadoes for example, and they can pop up almost anywhere and damage your troops a lot. Sometimes that will lead to a situation where you will get a natural disaster like that and it will mess up your plans. Maybe you will get one while you're fighting a war and it will damage your troops, or maybe it will damage your opponent's troops. In one of my games, for example, I got a barbarian raid on a higher difficulty, which can happen fairly frequently, but then I got a tornado on top of the barbarian raid, and it killed several of their units and heavily damaged the rest, and I was able to handle it quite easily. But it could have easily happened in reverse. It could have damaged or even killed my defenders. So if you like unpredictable things like that, then natural disasters are great. You can control the frequency, there's a setting that goes from 1 to 4, and I have to say, having played on maximum setting in most of my Gathering Storm games, I was a tiny little bit disappointed. I don't think they were quite frequent enough on the maximum setting. But there were still plenty, and you definitely need to adjust your gameplay for natural disasters. And it also makes you look completely differently at potential city locations. So as far as big signature features go, there's also the World Congress, which is easily one of the biggest new features in Gathering Storm, and it was desperately needed. It's one of those features that I really wish was present in the game right from the start, but obviously it was not, it's here now. And if you played Civilization 5, then the Civilization 6 version of the World Congress is quite a bit different. In Gathering Storm, you use Diplomatic Favor, which is basically a currency. You can trade it just like you can trade gold. And when a proposal comes up in the World Congress, you can use one vote for free on any given proposal, and then if you want to get more votes, you spend Diplomatic Favor. First, you spend 10 Diplomatic Favor to get your second vote, then you spend 20 to get the third vote, then you spend 30 to get another vote, and so on and so on. The cost goes up 10 diplomatic favor at a time. So if you want to, you can spend hundreds of diplomatic favor to ensure some proposal goes through. But then the proposals themselves are also quite interesting. So the proposals that come up are actually kind of random. What's not random is that a lot of the proposals involve making another secondary choice. So, for example, you can make buildings in a selected district cost less production, and you can pick any district you want. You can pick city center, you can pick campus, theater square, and so on. You can also get extra benefits from a selected city-state type, and then you get to choose which city-state type you want to target. You can make trade routes to the selected player, be worth more gold, but also give that player +1 extra trade route. Basically, pretty much every single proposal that comes up in the World Congress involves making a secondary choice while also placing your vote on option A or option B. The way it usually works is that option A is positive in some way, and then option B is negative. So for example, when a great person proposal comes up, the negative option would be not generating any great person point towards great people of that type, and you get to select which type it should be. So generally speaking, diplomatic favor is quite valuable, because a lot of these proposals can be very powerful, and there are quite a few that involve choosing a specific player, and you can obviously choose yourself. For example, there's one proposal that makes all the districts built by a selected player act as culture bombs, and that can be really good. You can use it to steal territory from your neighbors, as long as you can win the vote. And the World Congress can also be used for special sessions. So for example, if you are a suzerain of a city-state, and then some AI conquers that city-state, you can call for a special session of the World Congress, which costs some diplomatic favor just to call for that session, and then you can have an emergency against that specific AI that took the city-state. And the way it works is that if you vote for the emergency, you are always going to be part of that emergency. So any AI that votes for the emergency is automatically going to be part of it. They can't decline after. So that makes it so that there are a lot more participants of such emergencies now compared to previously. Especially if the vote is against an AI that's generally disliked by others. And of course, then there's the actual diplomatic victory, which is a new victory type that requires you to get 10 diplomatic victory points. And later into the game, you will get a diplomatic victory vote in the World Congress, which gives the winner of the vote 2 points at a time. So you need to win that vote 5 times, but there are also alternative ways of getting some diplomatic victory points. However, those are rare and hard to get. And as you remember, I mentioned that every vote has a negative option. Same in this case. Option B for diplomatic victory is to remove 1 point from the target player. In any case, to close the World Congress topic, the World Congress is easily one of the best new features added in Gathering Storm. One of the best new major features. It makes the game a lot more interesting, it makes diplomacy matter a lot more, and it can lead to some unpredictable opportunities to execute some interesting strategy based on the vote that just went through. As for diplomatic favor itself, the main sources of diplomatic favor are governments. You get diplomatic favor based on what government you're running. City-states, you get +1 point for each city-state you are the suzerain of. And also alliances. You get diplomatic points based on alliances you have and levels of those alliances. So both city-states and alliances matter a lot more now. They were already pretty damn important previously, but now they are even more important. And speaking of diplomacy, one of the things that you'll find yourself doing a lot more in Gathering Storm is trading and interacting with the AI. And not just because of diplomatic favor, which you can buy from the AI. And as a side note, I found that the AI is maybe a little bit too willing to sell its diplomatic favor. But regardless, the other reason why you will be interacting and trading with the AI a lot more in Gathering Storm are the new strategic resource mechanics. which might be a small thing at first glance, but it has major consequences for the game. So the way it works now is that strategic resources are a stockpile, and when you improve iron, for example, or horses, you will get +2 iron or +2 horses from that one resource. Later on, from some other resource types, you will get +3. And then you have a stockpile. The default maximum size of the stockpile is 50, and then that increases based on encampment district buildings you have. Each one will give you +10. And then each unit that requires a strategic resource early on, so for example swordsman, requires 20 iron, and that stops in mid-game, because once you get to oil, you will have to pay upkeep per turn in that resource. So 1 oil per turn, 1 coal per turn, 1 aluminum per turn. Even infantry requires oil per turn now, for example. So this system has a few major consequences. The first one is that obviously strategic resources become a lot more important. You can't just get one source and then have it cover everything, all of your needs, and recruit a huge army just from one single resource. That does not happen, that cannot happen. What does happen is that you end up trading a lot, regardless of the situation. If you have too many, then you will want to sell them before you hit the maximum stockpile, because once you hit 50, 60, 70 or whatever your maximum is, the excess is wasted, like it goes to waste. So you are obviously better off just selling it and then letting it build up again. If you don't sell it, then you are basically losing gold, you are wasting gold. And unfortunately you cannot set up like a per turn deal, for example. You can't sell 1 iron per turn, for example. You have to sell, let's say, 20 from your stockpile. So you will have to do that regularly. And then you can have the reverse situation, where you have a shortage. So then you will have to keep buying that resource from the AI. And again, you cannot set up a deal where you buy, let's say, 2 oil per turn. You have to buy 20 now, then 20 later, and then another 20 a little bit later again. So, generally speaking, you will find yourself trading strategic resources a lot. Which can be a good thing, don't get me wrong, because when Civilization 6 was originally released, there was very little interaction with the AI, or at least you really didn't need to interact with the AI a whole lot. You could just kind of ignore them. But now, between alliances, strategic resources, diplomatic favor, you cannot ignore them. And speaking of interaction with the AI, one of my favorite new small additions in the Gathering Storm is that you can now finally ask the AI to join an ongoing war and bribe them to do it if necessary. That's something that has been needed in Civilization 6 since the original release, in my opinion. Which works for both offensive and defensive wars. If you declare war on someone, you can go to several different AIs and attempt to pay them to join your war. If you get attacked by someone else and you didn't have alliances set up, you can ask the AIs to join your defensive war. You can do it anytime. Obviously they don't have to accept, and if they don't like you, they most likely will not accept. But you can do it, and from my experience, it's not too hard if you have semi-decent relations with the AIs. And speaking of relations with the AIs, I also find that agendas matter a lot less, and I really like that, because I think agendas had too big of an impact on your relations with the AI. It was too binary. But in Gathering Storm, I found that it's fairly easy to maintain very good relations with selected AIs, even if you don't fulfill their agenda. And speaking of relations with the AIs, this brings me to another point, and another new system in Gathering Storm, which is the grievance system, which replaced the warmongering system. And it's much better, in my opinion. So the way it works now is that certain actions will result in that specific player having grievances against you. So capturing their cities, obviously, denouncing them, declaring war, it will all result in grievances against you. And it works as a balance. Which means that if someone declares a surprise war on you, for example, which results in quite a lot of grievances, you can then commit that many grievances against that player without anyone caring. So you won't suddenly find all the AIs hating you because you defended yourself and retaliated. They still will if you go overboard, obviously, but you can now retaliate to some extent, with no penalty whatsoever. There's also another consequence of grievances, and it's the effect on loyalty. There is now additional loyalty pressure if you committed grievances against a target player. So, for example, if you conquer 3 cities from your neighbor and commit a lot of grievances against that neighbor as a result, then that neighbor will now get additional loyalty pressure against your cities. So it will be harder to not lose these cities to loyalty pressure. One interesting thing about the grievance system is that in the old system, the warmongering system, you could, for example, liberate some city-state and lose a lot of warmongering points. That's not what happens now. What happens now is that when you liberate a city-state, like in this example, you can gain 100 diplomatic favor. It has no effect on grievances. So overall, the grievance system is way better than the warmongering system. It doesn't really make domination easier or harder, strictly speaking. It does make it different, and you have to take different things into account now. I was able to completely conquer one of the AIs in one of my games, and I took like 5 or 6 cities from them, and I still had good relations with almost everyone when I was done. So, let's talk about the late game a little bit, shall we? There are some major changes in the late game now. One of them is climate change, which is a pretty interesting mechanic. The way it works is that when you build coal power plants or oil power plants, all of them will have a certain level of CO2 emissions, and based on the global CO2 level, you will progress through climate change phases. There are 7 phases, and each time you get to a new phase, some tiles on the map will flood, and then they will submerge eventually. And when a tile gets submerged, anything on that tile is lost permanently, and you cannot reverse that process. So if you had a district on that tile, it will be lost, it's gone. And now that tile will basically act like a coastal tile. You can enter it with ships. You might even be able to build a new canal, where one was previously impossible. There's one way to prevent that around your cities, and it's building flood barriers, which can be quite expensive, in terms of production that is, because you cannot just buy them with gold, you have to build them the hard way. And building them will prevent your tiles from being flooded. One thing that's worth noting is that you can actually see which tiles will be affected by rising sea levels, using the settler's lens. So when you found your cities at the start of the game, you can see which tiles exactly might or will be affected in the future by climate change. And I said well, because you have some control over how quickly it happens, but it will happen eventually. You can't stop the AI from building coal power plants, oil power plants, and things like that, so it will happen eventually. And if you don't build them yourself, then you're just penalizing yourself in terms of production. So it's not really a choice you can make all that much. You can slow it down a bit to make it happen later, give you some more time to build flood barriers, but that's about it. There is a carbon recapture project in the future era, and it's actually one of the ways to get diplomatic favor, because completing carbon recapture projects gives you some diplomatic favor in exchange. But generally speaking, rising sea levels don't really affect the map that much. They still do affect the map, and there will be tiles that will submerge, but you can avoid that fairly easily. Not only with flood barriers, but you can actually just found your cities in a way that will make them mostly unaffected. So I like the concept, it's very interesting, but I kind of wish they went a little bit further with it. Because as it stands right now, their natural disasters have a far greater impact on your general gameplay and on your strategy than rising sea levels. And since we are talking about late game, there's an actual future era now, which has its own technologies, and the interesting thing is that while the technologies are always the same, they will be connected differently in every single game you play. However, While there are many interesting technologies and civics in the future era, it suffers from one major problem. And that problem is that your game might be done long before you get a chance to take advantage of the future era. The way I see it, after playing several games, is that the future era is mostly like a thing that's supposed to give you an extra boost if the game is still not decided by then. Because depending on which victory condition you're going for, future era technologies or civics can help you a lot with that victory condition. But from my experience so far, in many games you will not really experience the future era much. Or maybe only 1, 2, maybe 3 techs from the future era. And then the game will be done. You can obviously just disable some victory conditions, especially ones that tend to happen fairly early, but that's a bit of a roundabout solution. And other than all these major new features, there are a ton of smaller changes in the game, and it's really kind of hard to list all of them because there are so many. There are tunnels now, there are railroads, there's a production queue feature, only 2.5 years late, there are new reports, there are a lot of small improvements. There is even a new play by cloud option for multiplayer. So it's kind of like a more modern version of play by email, except your save is stored on the cloud server. And you can invite friends, and you'll get notifications when it's your turn. So it's a really nice way to play a game like Civ in multiplayer. If you don't have the time to just sit down for several hours and play through a Civ game, which a lot of people don't. There is one more thing I kind of need to point out. And it's a bit of a power creep issue, because a lot of the new civs in Gathering Storm are really powerful. Now, balanced civilizations isn't really something Civ did very well in the past. I mean, if we look at Civilization 5, then civs like Poland, Arabia, Korea existed and were never really changed. But quite a few new civilizations in Gathering Storm are just a little bit too good, in my opinion. They definitely start to cross into the overpowered territory. And before we wrap this up, there's one last thing that I want to mention, and it's performance. Now, I'm playing the game on a GTX 980 and on an i7 4790K, which is obviously not exactly a bleeding edge machine, it's not, but I had to turn down quite a few graphical settings to make the game run in a reliable 50-60 FPS. And for a while it was dipping down like below 30 or even below 20. So if you were waiting for performance improvements in Gathering Storm, I can't say I really noticed any personally. So with all that said, what is the answer to the question from the video title? Is Civilization 6 Gathering Storm any good? And my answer is yes, but if your number one priority is the AI, if you stopped playing Civilization 6 because of how dumb AI was, then that didn't really change in Gathering Storm. And obviously, if the art style of Civilization 6 really bothered you, then obviously that didn't change. But as far as pretty much everything else goes, Gathering Storm is a really good expansion. The major features are good and fun to use, and they keep you engaged. There are plenty of smaller features and quality of life improvements, and overall it's just fun to play, more so than it was previously, in vanilla or with Rise and Fall. Another way to look at it is, if you thought Rise and Fall was a good expansion, then Gathering Storm is just so much better than that. There are so many more interesting features here. But on the most fundamental level, it's still the same game. There are just more systems built on top of it now. So in the end, the simplest answer is yes, it's a good expansion, but not if you expect the AI to suddenly get smarter. From me, overall, it's a thumbs up. And that's also going to be the end of this video. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed it. This was a little bit different than my usual content, so let me know what you think. And if you want to chat more in real time than YouTube comments allow, I'm always around on my Discord server, which is discord.gg/Marbozir. So thanks for watching again, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.